Well, let's get the webinar underway. Thanks to all of you for joining us. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Matt Fulton. I'm the Vice President for National Engagement with POLCO. I come to this with a background in city management of over 30 years. I had the privilege of serving a term on the board for ICMA. And so I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. The title of this webinar is How to Guide American Rescue Plan Act Fund with Community Input. Our hope is that the conversation and the information that we plan on sharing with you will kind of help you navigate your way through the ARPA process and to help you move your community forward. We also want to provide you with some best practices and some tips around engagement and some information around tools and resources that we have that we can make available to you to help you through this very important and unique program. And we're also very excited to be involved and have a partnership with ICMA in this overall effort. Next slide. You know, it's very difficult to just even quantify the significance of the disruption that's happened to every community, every family, every business over the past year plus. Everything has shifted. What was a priority in 2018 may very well not be a priority today. So as communities start to think about how to use your ARPA resources and how to use these funds to advance your community needs, I think it's really important to first understand what the current needs and priorities are. And because there is so much flexibility in the program, it's really incumbent upon community leaders to think long-term, be transformational, make wise investments with the use of these funds. Having a better understanding of resident and business perspectives can actually help you save money because you'll have a much better understanding about who are the groups that are being impacted, how are they being impacted, and how you can best align the ARPA resources to reach the best, most effective benefit to the community. As all of you can appreciate, communities have a responsibility to track the expenditures of the ARPA funds, and there really needs to be a way to effectively measure the impact that comes with the use of those funds. One of the things we've learned during the pandemic is that trust in local government and the levels of engagement have actually increased, just given kind of the virtual nature of how local governments have served their local communities. The ARPA program provides this great opportunity to continue building strong engagement with your residents and benefiting from the wisdom of all of your community stakeholders. It's going to allow you to really invest in those areas that have been impacted the most. And it's really exciting to kind of consider the positive impacts that this federal program can have on local economies. Although it's equally as important to realize and the value of being able to tell a bigger story about how the ARPA funds have been used in helping communities across the country. I think that's really important. It's a really important aspect of what we hope you will pick up during today's conversation, and that you appreciate the value of being able to help build this broader national level narrative. Next slide. Here's the agenda for today's session. We have a great presentations planned from 4 well-recognized thought leaders and local government professionals. We're going to first hear from ICMA about the values of the ARPA program and the importance of working together. And then we have the opportunity to share ideas on how to build stronger engagement in your communities and some best practices around engagement, including ideas on how you can reach those harder to reach populations in your community. We're really fortunate to have the opportunity to learn about Moorpark, California, and how they have integrated the perspectives that they have gained through the use of the National Community Survey. They've integrated it into their strategic planning and budget processes. And then finally, happy to share with you information about POLCO'S ARPA engagement package, which has been designed to help communities work through this ARPA program, do community needs assessments, develop the effectiveness program for tracking how well the ARPA funds have benefited the community. So we're really excited about this presentation and the opportunity to share information with you. Feel free as we're going through, provide questions in the chat. We've programmed some time at the end of the session to try to respond to as many of those as possible. With that, let's kick into the program. Let me introduce our panelists. Elizabeth Kellar, who's the Director of Public Policy with ICMA, will get us going right away. We have Cory Plasch, who serves as POLCO'S Vice President in Strategic Development. PJ Gagajena, Assistant City Manager in Moorpark, California, and Michelle Kobayashi, who's POLCO'S Senior VP for Innovation. Thanks again for attending this session, and I would like to now hand it over to Elizabeth.
Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate you setting the stage here. This American Rescue Plan really gives us a great opportunity that we don't want to squander. And this is a perfectly timed webinar because right now is when we need to be assessing the needs and identifying the gaps. So let's talk about some of the once in a generation opportunities that we have here. There's other federal money that's available right now. There's the CARES Act that's been extended if you haven't spent that all together. There's also some money from the FEMA disaster resistance, and there's specific grants, but there's really nothing like the American Rescue Plan. It's flexible, it's large, and it just cries out for a long-term plan and strategy for the best way to use it. That means the importance of engaging with your community is going to be terribly important so that you get a sense of where the community is in terms of its priorities and how you can best make your communities more resilient. I'm very pleased about ICMA's partnership with POLCO in this endeavor because, you know, personally, I've had the opportunity to work with both POLCO and the National Research Council on other projects, and it's a really well-run outfit. I think you're going to find that having a one-stop shop for your community surveying needs and analytics is going to be really helpful. And you're also going to realize, I think, when you get into this, that having a tool like this to help you manage some of the data analytics is going to be really important. So much has changed in our communities over the last 18 months that we really need to, you know, not just understand what the situation was 2 years ago before COVID, but how much things have changed and what we've learned. Next slide. So the database, I started my career in the city of Sunnyvale, and one of the things that we prided ourselves on was having a great database. And having something like this, where we can tap into a national database of information on how the funds are being used is going to be really helpful. ICMA, National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, and others found ourselves in a more challenging position with the CARES Act. We were constantly trying to tell our story, trying to do quick polls to explain what the fiscal situation was, and also to be able to demonstrate how the funds are being used. So I think it's a wonderful opportunity here to have a national database that we can use to tell our story more effectively. I will say, you know, having a resident survey is an important part of the process, and there's a lot of things have changed since I started my career in Sunnyvale years ago, but we would do an annual survey just to see what was important to residents and how satisfied they were with the services. So I think, you know, you always want to take the pulse of the people and your key stakeholders. Next slide. And I think lastly, and perhaps most importantly, you'll find that with this information, it will help you tell your story more effectively. You're going to want to be able to explain, you know, exactly how you've used the money, and also don't forget to invite your congressional representatives as you're doing that. You'll be giving your residents regular updates on your progress. You'll want to be giving a lot of information out there to your community on your progress, but you also want to make sure that the people who voted for this get the credit and recognition for it. And having this kind of data at your fingertips and being able to tell your story effectively is an important part of that. And I think finally, being part of a national effort like this, you'll have a chance also to learn from others. So thank you.
So let's talk a little bit then about public engagement in ARPA. Next slide, please. Why do we want to engage? First, the first reason is it's the right thing to do. It's the best practice for communities. Engaging your residents is just a best practice. But in this particular circumstances, more importantly, that's actually what the Treasury guidance is telling us that they're looking for. Their guidance says that they're urging state, territorial, tribal, and local governments to engage their constituents and communities in developing plans to use these payments, given the scale of funding and its potential to catalyze broader economic recovery and rebuilding. This truly, as has already been mentioned, is a once in a lifetime opportunity, and they want to make sure that everybody's involved. Next slide, please. So let's talk about different ways to engage our community then. Some of the more common ones that you may know about, things like resident comment, and that can come in a variety of different ways. Whether that's something like social media or something like that, something that's a little bit more structured. Town hall meetings or board meetings can be a great way to go ahead and engage your residents in decision making. But I do have to say that what we have found with COVID is that there can be some real challenges to that. And, not even with, COVID being sick, but simply, I think it's brought to light of the fact that, with those sorts of in-person meetings, sometimes there's barriers and we're not getting everybody that we want there. Focus groups have got some of the same challenges. They're great when we can get everybody together, but there's also some barriers. And then the last one is to do surveys and polls. Next slide, please. What we want to do is we want to lower the barriers to participation, because what it does is reintroduce reasonable voices. So my background is actually in local government. I started as a 911 dispatcher, and I also dealt with liquor in a college town. So when you want to talk about hearing from, all sorts of people with kind of an axe to grind, boy, I was the poster child for that for a while. I had all sorts of people who were coming in specifically about, liquor issues, and weren't really hearing from them the rest of the time. But what do the residents think? What do they really feel about it? The easier you can make it for them to engage, the more it is that you're going to be able to hear their voices. What we did back then was we would have a liquor commission meeting, and we would say, okay, it's 7 o'clock on a Saturday, and come on in, expect to spend 3 hours here. And it's no surprise we didn't get a lot of response. But if we can go ahead and lower those barriers, we can hear from a much broader cross section of the community. Think about people like working parents, or just people who are busy, working professionals, even moms who don't have childcare. Those can all be ways where people are not able to come, transportation being an issue. But if we're able to go ahead and lower some barriers, we're really able to bring more people in. Next slide, please. So when we're talking about engagement, we really have to talk about engaging hard to reach populations. I think that's also one of the things that has become so noted over the last year and a half or so, is the impact of not hearing from some of those members of our community, particularly those who have been traditionally marginalized. And again, not only is it important, is it a best practice, but now again, the Treasury is reaching out with their guidance and giving us some more information about that. So what they're saying is that there's disparate impact on some communities, and they're saying that finally, although the pandemic's impacts have been widespread, both the public health and economic impacts of the pandemic have fallen most severely on communities and populations disadvantaged before it began. Low-income communities, people of color, and tribal communities have faced higher rates of infection, hospitalization, and death, as well as higher rates of unemployment and lack of basic necessities like food and housing. While with COVID hopefully kind of going into the rearview mirror, some of these things may have changed. A lot of these, though, these are issues that are going to be with us for a while. Next slide, please. So how can we broaden that net further and really hear from some of those people in our community it may be a little bit more difficult from? The first thing that we want to do is we want to partner with trusted community leaders. So when we're talking about things like community-based organizations. So if you think about it, we're working with several organizations right now that are reaching out to perhaps a community organization that serves the Latinx community. That might be a way to do it. Your local school district might be a great way to go ahead and reach out. Whoever has voices of credibility in the community, leaders of communities of faith can have a great opportunity to really reach out because they do have that credibility. Schools, businesses. Businesses a lot of times are reaching every member of the community. Everybody has to go to the grocery store. There's some other things that people do on a regular basis. You can enlist them because they can have a very powerful voice in the community. And then other government agencies. So maybe you can go ahead and team up with maybe the local health department, or if it's a separate district, maybe your local library. There's a lot of other ways that we can go ahead and partner with people that we know have got different reach into the community than perhaps local government does. Next slide, please. We want to also use culturally relevant practices. So things like translation. A lot of times, quite honestly, even when we do Spanish translation, they aren't necessarily used as much, but the fact that you're making the effort to go through and to provide a Spanish translation can be very powerful about just the messaging that you are sending, that being able to hear from people who do not necessarily speak English as their first language is really important. Their preferred method of outreach, it may be different for some groups than for others. There may be some where, again, they're doing things in more of a in-person type of thing. Again, think kind of community of worship or something like that. We want to make sure that we are reaching out in the way that is best culturally for a variety of different populations. Also, their preferred mode of communication. Again, we can do some, some things in person, things such as surveys where we can really reach out to the community, and then important barriers. Just always be aware of that when we're talking about hard to reach populations, some of the things that we are talking about are things, perhaps lower socioeconomic, people of color, English as a second language, young adults. If you're able to do things so that things like broadband access is not an issue, you're able to, for example, use a survey where you can access that through a smartphone. That can lower a barrier for being able to get people in and being able to do things. So mobile responsive types of outreach is really important. Next slide, please. We want to capitalize on tech. You want to reduce that burden on them. As I was kind of mentioning before, technology now is allowing us to go ahead and to meet in ways that we really didn't think about meeting 10 or 15 years ago. Everything had to be on person, and we don't have to do that anymore. Not only does it reduce the burden on the people who we want to respond, it also saves resources and it meets people right where they are. If you're, somebody is sitting up at 2 o'clock in the morning, they just got the baby back to bed and they're, just kind of surfing through the internet, they could be taking a survey if it's available to them online. So just really capitalize on tech when we're going ahead and looking at ways to reach out. Next slide, please. And then also oversample hard to reach populations. So let's just be very straight here. There's a reason why we call these populations hard to reach, because even with our best efforts, we may not get the response, but that's why it's more important to really double down and really make that effort. So some of the ways that we can do that, we can increase our income or outreach to things like low income census tracts or blocks. We're talking about things like multifamily housing. A lot of times that can be the places where people who are lower socioeconomic, people who are young, people of color, they may be more likely to be in multifamily housing. And then also making specific outreaches to neighborhoods with people of color. And you're going to have to get creative in the way that you do that. Maybe it's something where you're using a QR code. Again, it's been kind of one of the silver linings of COVID is people actually are used to using a QR code now. Maybe you go ahead and you put a QR code on flyers, and you're putting those, for example, in bus stations, in neighborhoods that are of color or other demographics that you're really trying to reach out that you don't think are being well represented. You just have to be really creative in the way that you go ahead and reach out, and you really have to make a more concerted effort in those communities. Next slide, please. And then also consider a panel, because once you find them, you can keep them. So what you can do is that you can ask them to serve as a resident voice. You can ask them to give 10 or 20 minutes a month to go ahead and to give you input. You can build that over time, and you can monitor the diversity of it. And one of the nice things about doing this in particular is that you can also ask them to invite their peers. Again, kind of going back to that credibility thing, what we have found is especially with young adults, that if they are hearing something from their peers, they can reach out and they can get more people involved. When you've got them, bring them into a panel, keep them invested, keep them going, and always make sure that you share what the impact is of the information that you're giving them. Don't leave them in the dark, but go ahead and continue providing them the information that they need. A lot of times we're talking about our residents, they're not expecting to get $1, in an envelope in the mail or anything. They want to know what's being done with the information that they gave. Was it worth their time? So make sure that let them know how it is that you're using the information. Next slide, please. And then we want to make sure that we're always engaging our residents in community decision making. So we want to do things like we want to do a baseline, identifying needs and baseline measurements. We want to make sure that we understand stakeholder knowledge, sentiments, and behavior. Where are their gaps? What kind of interests do they have? There's a couple of examples here. What kind of amenities do you want to see? You want to prioritize initiatives and alternatives, engaging your residents again to determine those community priorities. How important is it to focus on A rather than B? Which of these out of this 10, which 3 or 4 do you think are the most important? and then evaluate the performance. You want to do periodic surveys to provide performance metrics, and also starts the process all over again as a needs assessment, kind of bringing you back to the beginning. It allows you to continue involving your residents in that decision-making process. Next slide.
Great, everyone. Yeah, PJ Gagajena, Assistant City Manager, City of Moorpark, and very thankful for having me today. And wanted to share with you how the City of Moorpark has used the National Community Survey as a tool for strategic planning and budget development. Next slide. Some basic facts about our community. We have 37,000 residents. We were incorporated in 1983. We're located in Southern California between Los Angeles and Santa Barbara. Our demographics are 56% white, 32% Latinx, 7% Asian, 4% other, 1% Black. Median income is $102,000. Median home sales price, $675,000. We have 53 full-time employees, $19 million operating budget. We are in a temperate vacation climate here in Southern California, about 30 minutes to local beaches. Some of our major assets are Moorpark College and America's Teaching Zoo, as well as our restaurants, unique stores and wineries and breweries. Moorpark is mostly residential, open space, mixed with retail and industrial. We have an incredible downtown known as High Street with a train station. Our downtown is the heart of our community. We have more than 2,000 residential units planned or under construction, and a mixed-use project in our downtown will be breaking ground soon. Our general plan update is underway, and we've also been rated for the second consecutive year as the third safest city in California by SafeWise. Next slide, please. In terms of our engagement efforts, we've made a concerted effort to involve as many residents as possible for our general plan update to plan for our city's future. The outreach effort began in 2020. Because of COVID, we restricted in-person engagement and utilized virtual platforms to connect with residents. We use social media, leverage the influence network resources of community and civic organizations and leaders. We have 18 residents on our general plan advisory committee to represent diverse backgrounds and interests. And we translated materials and had interpreters to engage our Spanish-speaking residents. The 2020 census was another engagement opportunity for us last year to encourage residents to be counted and submit their census surveys. This resulted in having an 83.5% response rate in our community, which is one of the highest rates in California when compared to the state average of 69%. Outreach and communication to local businesses was of critical importance during the pandemic to assess the needs of businesses and determine their survivability as we went through various shutdowns and reopenings. We implemented a business ambassador program to contact businesses, and we shared with them financial assistance resources. We worked closely with economic development partners in our local chamber. We also put together surveys and received high response rates along with more than 2,000 subscribers to our economic development electronic newsletter. And in preparing the update to our city council strategic plan and developing the budget, we decided to partner with POLCO and the National Research Center to conduct the city's first national community survey here in Moorpark. Next slide, please. As best practice and the culture set by the city council, city manager, we greatly value community input and having an open, transparent process. As an ICMA member, it's even our code of ethics, tenet number 9, to keep the community informed and encourage communication between residents and local government. And as part of our strategic planning process, we worked with POLCO and NRC late last year to conduct the National Community Survey. We received their survey report in January and shared the findings with the City Council in February during their strategic planning workshop. The survey was important to help identify the community's needs and priorities. It helped shape the City Council's goals for the next 2 years. And we reviewed the survey results with all of our employees and shared them with the community. And once the goals were established, staff went back to develop the objectives and tasks to meet the goals. And then the City Council approved the comprehensive strategic plan. Next slide, please. So some of the key findings from the National Community Survey were that our residents rated us very, very high on safety and as a great place to raise children. We received 96% ratings, excellent or good in those categories. Quality of life was also very good along with customer service. We had lower ratings as a place to work, cost of living, economic development, and arts and culture. And our city council definitely had those in mind when formulating their goals. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the 4 goals identified by our city council for the next 2 years. This includes number 1, providing housing for all economic and age ranges. Number 2, practicing respect, equity, inclusion. Number 3, focusing on economic development, especially our downtown area known as High Street. Number 4, enhancing arts, culture, entertainment, and public events. Next slide, please. So in terms of budget development, this was also a bottom-up approach, starting with residents' input from the National Community Survey. Once this shaped the strategic plan, we made sure we had the necessary funds and human resources available to implement those goals. Then we allocated funding in the budget for adoption. Next slide, please. So in this slide, this is actually an excerpt from our city manager's budget message in our budget book. And you can see how we referenced the National Community Survey, which showed that 96% of our residents rated safety as excellent or good. We even used the survey report bar graph to illustrate these results. Next slide, please. This is another excerpt. We discussed economic development as well in the budget message, and it shows in graphic illustration explaining how we justified adding more resources to this area. This also helps the city council and staff respond to questions from the public on how we came up with a budget and why we prioritize certain areas versus others. Council members have to make very difficult decisions when adopting a budget, and having the National Community Survey as a source document to refer to is very helpful. Next slide, please. So some key lessons that we went through in this process. Resident input is critical in shaping a city's priorities and services. It was very important for us here in Moorpark. Surveys provide an objective data and metrics about community needs, as opposed to hearing only from a few local residents. Surveys are a useful tool, but not the only tool. There remain challenges engaging hard-to-reach communities, as previously discussed. And it's critical to still have in-person engagement with residents. This means going to places where people live, congregate, building trust with residents, having materials translated, having interpreters available to increase participation rates. It's also critical to align budget and human resources to successfully achieve goals. It's important to monitor performance and measure success in achieving goals and meeting community needs. And going back to your residents, which we plan to do to follow up to see how well we are doing going forward, as we plan to issue the National Community Survey again in 2022. We are in the process of identifying projects and programs available for the American Rescue Plan Act, and we'll be presenting that to the City Council soon. The National Community Survey will definitely be a key resource to help guide us in this process. Next slide. So go to the City of Moorpark website to see our National Community Survey results, and my contact information is listed there if you have any questions. I'll pass it on to Michelle now.
Thank you. I am excited to be here today. I actually have been doing research and evaluation in local government for the past 30 years. I know, yikes, I'm getting old. But I've spent, worked with hundreds of communities over the last 3 decades to help bring resident opinions into local government decision making. So the whole idea of the ARPA funding and engaging residents and businesses in the community decision making is super exciting to me. Hearing PJ's presentation right now just warmed my heart, because I love to see local governments finding ways to infuse this important source of information into their decision making. Next slide, please. So we're in unprecedented times. COVID has turned many of our worlds upside down. Not only is it a physical challenge, it's caused emotional, economic challenges to many of us, many of our communities. And in a way, it's actually impacted every aspect of community livability that we look at National Research Center POLCO. In some ways, it's been positive in areas maybe in terms of mobility, parks and rec, but we know that for most of the community's characteristics or areas of community livability, COVID has posed more negative challenges. We know that economies have been hurt by the decline in revenues and loss of small local businesses. We know that education, arts, culture have been impacted by students not being able to attend online, and inclusivity and engagement have suffered because we're not face-to-face, we're not congregating, we are feeling isolated. So we know there's some real serious challenges. We also know that challenges that were already existing in our communities, or at least in some of our communities, such as housing, food security, broadband access, those may have already been there, but we know that COVID actually exacerbated those issues. And we're seeing those disparities play out more so in our communities. So we have all these impacts of COVID, and now we have this fantastic funding source, but the question of the hour is, how do we spend that money? There's so many places that need help, and what areas need the most rescue? So our next slide, please. Our goal with creating this ARPA engagement package along with ICMA is to really help communities through this journey, help them figure out how to best spend the funds, how to evaluate if the funds were well used, and make so that we are really creating sustainable change in our communities. So our goals are really we want to measure resident and business stakeholders so we can prioritize how we spend the money from the start. We want to be able to monitor the changes in effectiveness of community initiatives. We need to monitor our communities because also COVID is maybe not quite done. So we still don't know what's going to happen in our communities and what kind of needs may arise. But we also want to monitor what we've done, what we've spent money on, to see if we're doing a good thing. We want to be able to identify and share best practices because we're kind of in an era of trial and error. It's all new to all of us. So I believe a lot of innovative, fantastic ideas are going to come out of this money, but it's great if we can share that information and replicate it. And we also really want to make sure that we're assisting local governments to use ARPA funds to create long-term community improvements. We can easily use the money to put a Band-Aid on some of the problems in our communities. But the goal would be to really invest in solutions that create long-term solutions for communities. And by involving residents and businesses in the decisions up front and over time, you're going to ensure that you do more of this in a fiscally responsible way. Next slide, please. So we have an entire engagement package, what I'm going to talk about more towards the end of my presentation, but the foundation of this package really has to do with the ARPA engagement survey. This is a survey or index of questions that will be administered to residents and businesses every 6 months, starting at baseline, and then we will monitor progress over time. And that survey is based on some of the key indicators that we've developed and collected over time in the National Community Survey and National Business Survey. So they're tried and true questions, vetted, and a lot of communities have trend lines for this information already. But using some of this information as well as ARPA specific data, we're going to help communities form these baseline surveys identifying where you need to spend money, but also then monitor that over time. In addition to this ARPA engagement survey, which communities will administer, we have other opportunities where you can engage with your residents. You can use our POLCO library on our engagement platform to dig deeper. For instance, if you find out from your ARPA engagement survey that housing challenges are big in your community, you can dig deeper and send out a survey that asks residents more about, is it the quality? Is it the affordability? Is it the fact that you don't have universal design? What are the issues residents are experiencing with housing? And how does that affect different population subgroups? We also have some deep dive tools like the National Community Survey, National Business Survey, if you want to get really specific indicators on the quality and importance of different community amenities. Next slide, please. And so in terms of what we offer in our engagement survey, there's really 4 major sections of questions. The first section really has to do with overall community quality. We ask people about the quality of various aspects of community livability and also the importance of that facet in their communities. Through that, we can actually help identify critical focus areas. We also ask residents to tell us the personal impacts of COVID. We have about 35 questions on challenges they've been experiencing based on the pandemic, and we can actually then start to quantify how many residents are impacted in your community and which areas are those where we really did take more of an effort or need more funds. For the business owners who complete the survey, we'll also identify business impacts. Are they having issues? Is it still a revenue shortage, or now is it finding skilled employees, or is it protecting their employees from COVID, or providing premium pay? But we'll hear from the business community about what their biggest issues are. And then we also ask the residents and business owners, how should we use the ARPA funds based on the funding buckets stated by the Treasury? And this is great to understand not only how residents see these funds should be spent, but also for local government to understand what residents are desiring. Because what we may find in some cases is where they want you to spend funds may not make as much sense as you see. And so it may be that not only you may spend money there, but you may also want to do more outreach or education to let residents know what areas of the community really are being hit hard, even if it's not their experience in terms of what's happening from COVID. Next slide, please. So here's some examples of the reporting you'll see on the POLCO platform. So if you get your residents and your business members, they will come to the platform, they'll complete the survey every 6 months. And what we'll find is every 6 months, we'll get reporting back that tells you not only what's happening in terms of community livability, but also how we see those changes in resident and business needs shaping over time. So here's a dashboard that is one of my particular favorites, but basically we look at how residents rate the quality of the community in a variety of different areas: health and wellness, natural environment, economy. And then we also ask them how important it is that we use ARPA funds in those areas of community livability. And we create what we call a performance importance matrix. You'll see this little chart at the bottom of the screen. But basically, we can help you map these different quality and importance ratings so that you can identify the critical focus areas. Through this, we can identify which areas residents say are not very good, but also super important. So that's a great way to help identify how to spend money up front. Also to watch this over time. Next slide, please. We also, like I talked about, we've identified 35 different challenges that residents may have experienced based on COVID and kind of those treasury buckets. Also some business challenges, 15 of those. And we will measure those over time to see how many of your residents are experiencing or what proportion are experiencing these challenges. And this again can help you identify, is housing stability important? Is it food security? Is it aid to small businesses? Is it broadband infrastructure? Where is it we want to spend our money based on how many people are really experiencing this problem in their communities? Next slide, please. Also, really important to the Treasury and the federal government, and I think really important to a lot of us in our communities, is that whole issue that Cory talked about, and what we talked about up front, is this whole idea that equity and the disparities being actually inflated during COVID. So we may have already had health disparities and housing disparities and educational disparities, but we know in many communities, these have grown broader and wider. And so one of the things we want to track over time is to look at these challenges we see across our communities. Are they significant? Do we need to address it? Is it a broadband issue for the entire community? Are there segments of the population that are having more issues with broadband and technology? And then what we want to do over time, if we decide to put money into decreasing disparities, is look to see if these disparities have we made them more narrow? Have we made it so that people are on the same page? If that's the goal of your community, looking at these type of charts will really help you to understand not only where to spend funds to be more efficient, but also, are you making the changes that you expect to change? Next slide, please. And then we talked a little bit about, but like really it is important to find out how your residents say you should spend the ARPA funds. There are buckets that the Treasury has given us, asking these are the areas they prefer you spend the money in. And so it's nice to ask your residents how they feel about it so they can tell you their priorities and you can get a sense of where they feel like the value is and what local government should be doing. And again, like I said, if you find out sometimes what the residents want and what you're seeing from other parts of your index or what you know from the community aren't in complete alignment, that helps you to understand how to give more education and outreach and to help people understand why it is that you are investing in a certain segment of the population or in a certain funding bucket, because there are all kinds of issues affecting us and all kinds of needs for the Rescue Fund Acts. Next slide, please. And then after we do the survey the first time and get all this information on how to spend the money, we use the same tool or many parts of the tool to help evaluate our progress. Like we said, COVID will be changing our communities for the next years. Even if we get it more under control, there's still going to be things we don't understand about what's being impacted, what's growing, what's changing. So it's really important we monitor our community over time. But we also really want to look more closely at those areas where we chose to spend our money. So if we choose to spend our money in certain Treasury funding buckets, we want to make sure that that's paying back. Make sure we don't need, because often even though you have a good intention, doesn't mean it's going to have the outcome as you hoped. And so in some cases, you may want to decide to stop doing something, you may decide to tweak something, or you may decide you want to double down on a program that's working really well. But it's just really important to monitor that over time to make sure what you intend is what impacts we see in our community. So some of the ways we will be showing you through this package of those kinds of progress or the success is we'll compare you to the national benchmark. We have national data we'll be collecting. We've had some from the past and we'll continue to compare that. So you can see how you're doing in comparison to other communities. And sometimes to those benchmarks, it's really hard to tell how tall or small you are until you see a larger population. We believe that these benchmarks will help folks understand how successful they've been. We also will use the folks that are succeeding above benchmarks to identify best practices and have them share information with the rest of us. Next slide, please. We also believe that your own data over time is probably the most important indicator of how well you're doing. And so the dashboard will also show you how you are moving the needle in the areas where residents, and through the other work we've done, we identified as critical focus areas. Are you making progress in the areas you intended? Are you also making sure you ensure progress in the areas that are still really important, folks? We don't want to plan programs that help one area and take away from another program. So by monitoring the community over time, we actually will help you strengthen your programs and make sure they make sense and you're being as successful as possible. Next slide. And finally, the area of the household challenges, business challenges, those that are kind of looking at that equity inclusion, who's being impacted, and understanding the proportion of your populations really needing rescuing. We will over time be able to measure those indicators to sort of find out, do you have more or less people that have housing challenges 1 year, 2 years after the funding goes in? Will you have more people or less people with having broadband issues? We also, again, can look at those gaps to make sure residents in the population subgroups who tended to be hit hardest by the pandemic, making sure they're coming up to par with the groups who did not have as many impacts. So we think it's really important to be able to look at that over time and make sure that, again, your interventions are having the intended consequences. Next slide, please. And so I talked about these ARPA surveys and these kind of resident business engagements because they are the backbone of this package. However, we believe there's a lot more that needs to be done for us all to be successful. This is a new era. It is trial and error, and I think we really need to be supported in our work. So we have these kind of data-driven tools that we'll be using and giving local government information back. But we also are setting up opportunities for collaboration. We have POLCO Connect on the platform where communities can talk to each other about questions, if they can pose questions about what works well, what's not, if people have designed policies, can they share those? Through our database and through this platform, we can identify those who are doing best practices, and we can ask those folks to tell us, what is it you did? How did you change food security? How did you change housing security in your community? How did you manage resident input into decisions about cable and broadband? We also will put a bunch of data ebooks, presentations together with ICMA in terms of the shared findings, the best practices, how we're doing as a nation, and by different types of communities to show like really what is ARPA doing to revitalize our economies and our communities. And then again, with that collaboration, building in those experts. So we can have folks come in, and if we identify that there's an issue that's common across many communities that they need some input on, we can work with ICMA and other partners to come in and give examples of policies and programs and types of information that would help folks hone their programs and develop the strongest programs they can for the best buck. We also will do webinars, next steps workshops, helping you debrief your data, identifying issues where you need to take more action. But again, it's a whole package, wraparound services that have to do with being first data focused, but also then connecting with each other, sharing responsibility and information so that we all do the best job possible to improve our communities across America. And that's all I have to say. I'm going to turn it back to Matt to close up more of the discussion of this ARPA engagement.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, and everybody. Really appreciated you kind of going over the ARPA package. I just want to kind of re-emphasize, and while I'm re-emphasizing my point, I would ask anybody that has any questions, please put it in the chat. And we've got 15 minutes left, so we have plenty of time for responding to questions. But I mentioned earlier that communities can sometimes better align and even save money by having the data that can be generated through the ARPA program, just simply because you are getting a better assessment as to where current needs and priorities are. And if you know how issues are impacting a certain demographic group or a certain segment of your community, you'll have that ability then to align your resources accordingly. I would love though, Michelle, maybe Michelle or Elizabeth, one of the really core values and opportunities that we have here is this aggregation of community data to create this national picture. And maybe I can pose a question to Elizabeth about what is the value of doing that from a national perspective?
It's extremely helpful to have perspective. And one way that we get perspective is if everybody across the country is struggling in a particular area, then we can compare ourselves apples to apples and say, okay, yeah, this is a common problem. And I'm concerned about how my community is struggling with this issue. And yet I can see that you know, this is an area where many communities have challenges. And then, it makes it even more valuable, as we were just talking about, if you have outliers that they're off the charts, they're doing really well. So you can get that leading community to share its experience. And that's how places like ICMA really try to shine a spotlight. We try to catch people doing things right and shine a spotlight on it.
Michelle, do you have anything to add?
No, I totally agree with Elizabeth. I think it's the beauty of the aggregation that helps us identify common challenges and also the best practices. I also think there's, if we are able to report the data at regional, state, national levels, that helps our electeds understand what the issues are and take action. It's my goal that, we have ARPA funding for 4 years, but it could be that if we identify issues, best practices, those types of things can continue 4 years from now. And so we need to keep our local government and our communities in the eyes of those folks making decisions about funding in the future. And the more we can aggregate data, show our successes and our challenges, the more of a voice we have in terms of talking to electeds and people who represent us, and talking to the community as a whole for folks who are critical of how we spend funds, or how if the American Rescue Act is really doing what it's intended. The more we can aggregate those outcomes to show that we actually are changing people's lives and communities, the less we'll have those people criticizing what we're all doing.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And the other aspect is, if you think of segments of communities, the majority of communities are small communities. And so having the ability to understand what are the issues how are small communities being impacted, and being able to look at data collectively together, focusing in on those smaller populations becomes a really meaningful tool when you're trying to address issues that are impacting those particular and specific groups. So thank you for that. We have a couple of questions that have come in. So let me just go through this, and I'll open it up to whoever wants to respond. First one is, how can we use this topic, or how can we use this to help with complex public health and economic development needs? Michelle, that's probably best directed towards you.
Can you read that again one more time, Matt?
Yep. How can we use this to help with complex public health and economic development needs?
Okay, well, so the surveys, they provide data on public health, economic, and all other areas of community livability. So we're actually gauging and assessing all the types of community attributes at the same time, which is helpful. But they are complicated, and we are going to have to make some hard choices. So we believe by asking the questions broadly about all the different areas of community livability, and then also including like stakeholders in those decision processes, it helps to make some of those complicated decisions more easier. That doesn't mean that we have the solutions. It doesn't mean the survey is going to come out and say exactly do X, Y, Z. But what the surveys are going to do is stop conversations where you have people that have pet projects, or you have special interest groups at the table arguing that this is the most important issue they need to address. What the survey is going to do is provide broad perspectives of a representative group of residents across the community and businesses, so that all those data are on a level playing field in terms of what's important, what's not. And I think it'll help us make those trade-offs. I think also one of the things that's interesting, and one of the things we do in the Next Steps workshop, which was listed on the slide but I didn't talk much about, is we actually do these workshops where we help folks take together all these different kinds of issues and challenges. And one of the things we do is give people credit for creating solutions that actually solve issues in many areas. We give people you get credit for solving issues that actually solve more than one problem at once. And it also gets people from different domains, different spectrums talking to each other. So let's have the public health department talk to the economic group, talk to the Parks and Rec, and let's create solutions that go across community silos, but also across funding mechanisms. Because what I have a background in public health, but what I know in terms of creating public health solutions, they're not health oriented that really make the big differences. It's actually solutions that go across the spectrum that change public health. And so the more we can get these data, rally around these data, and get people to the data table that are from various backgrounds, I think we can solve more of that complicated nature of making these decisions, if that makes sense.
Matt, I would add something to what Michelle was just talking about, and that is, it's mostly small communities, right? And it's mostly small businesses that have been suffering the most out of this pandemic and the challenge of economic recovery. So the fact that you have a process to engage those small businesses, and I was struck by PJ's example of the business ambassadors. This is really where we have to put some extra effort in as we engage, is to figure out, okay, well, what are the gaps? Do we have, for instance, a digital literacy challenge that we need to focus on. You know, maybe people have broadband, but they don't know how to use some of the tools at their fingertips. So I think it's a really good way to surface where the challenges are. And certainly we know our small businesses have really struggled.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And you know, Michelle, one of the points you brought up was the aspect of communities having the opportunity to learn what's important in their communities, but then to dig deeper. And maybe, Cory, can you talk about the POLCO library and how that will play into this conversation and how it can help communities with the ARPA efforts?
Sure, absolutely. So the POLCO library actually is over 100 surveys now that are available on POLCO, where you can just go ahead. Actually, they're available. You can move them in draft form right into your profile. You can edit them as needed, but it really kind of helps you dig in a little bit deeper to some of these issues. So say, for example, you know, mobility is coming out as a big issue. You're able to actually dig into a whole lot of different aspects of mobility. They're very, very specific and very focused to learn a little bit more. And again, we kind of talked about that panel. When you've got that panel of people, you keep on engaging them, because as we kind of talked about, if you've learned anything out of COVID, is that things keep on changing. And so we'll be able to really kind of track with some of those surveys if there are changes between when you do that initial ARPA index and maybe you know, some things that you're able to do later. It may give you some initial indications if you're starting to move that needle, but it's all available there in the POLCO library for you, all created by National Research Center. Especially most of it was done by Michelle Kobayashi. So it's a great resource.
Thank you, Cory. We have a question from Jane. Jane, thanks for the question. So is this a traditional survey like those National Research Center used to do, or is this some new methodology hybrid using the POLCO citizen engagement methods? Michelle, you want to take that?
Certainly. Hi, Jane. We've worked with Jane for many years. Basically, it's a hybrid. It is. We have some of the strengths of the traditional NRC method. So you will have the postcards probability survey going out, but all folks will be coming online to answer the survey. In addition, we will have that non-probability component for local governments to do their own outreach, and both those data sets will be combined on the platform, but we'll be able to differentiate those and weight them and make it statistically representative of the community. So it's kind of a hybrid, but we still have the strength of the probability, but we also have this advantage of doing the non-probability. And what I love about that whole non-probability survey, which is where you have open participation in the survey research world, we call it non-probability. But basically, I love the idea of the snowball technique. I love the idea because we're having so much trouble these days getting some of these hard to reach people into government decision making. So the ability to have this non-probability methodology with the snowball methodology, where we can give the survey out to a faith-based community or a community partner or someone who's trusted. Those folks can send it to people that we want to hear from, and they can share that. I love that component. So I want to make sure that all elements of the community are brought into the decision making. So on the platform, we'll have both of those. So we're going to have the strength of both methods coming together. And so I'm super excited about that. But all the reporting will be on the platform. And you'll see that we'll have like really cool dashboards, but more interactive, so you can dig deeper and look more at these crosstabs. So I'm excited about that as well. But definitely has the base of the traditional NRC survey at its core to make sure we're getting that representation.
That's great. Thanks. Can you elaborate a little bit more on how we can use this to make sure better equity in the ways we allocate ARPA funds? Maybe Michelle again.
I can take it. Well, those dashboards we showed on the equity, I think that's one of the best places for us to look, because it may be that overall 80% of the community is not having a household challenge because of COVID. But if we find out through the equity dashboard that people of color are twice as likely to have an equity challenge, or folks from rental units have much more of an issue with broadband, that's when we're going to identify equity. We're going to understand that those folks aren't all experiencing the same community. And then we're going to also monitor that, like I said, every 6 months to see if those gaps are widening or if they're narrowing, to see over time, to see, are we actually doing our job, making sure the folks who actually have been hit hardest are getting some of those recovery funds. So I think that equity dashboard is going to tell us a lot, and I'm super excited about that kind of analysis to be able to monitor over time.
And I think one thing to note on this is the fact that it is mobile responsive. The open participation surveys are mobile responsive. So one of the biggest gaps that we've seen with COVID has to do with broadband access. Anybody who knows teachers or has got school-age children, there's a big difference with the kids who did have internet service versus those who did not. But with the fact that it's mobile responsive, anybody with a smartphone, and a lot of our hard-to-reach populations do have smartphones, it is still a way for them to be involved if it's mobile responsive.
Anybody else have any responses? Carrie, thanks for the question. The question is, can you provide a range for the cost for the ARPA engagement package? Carrie, what we're really recommending is that you connect with POLCO. Every community needs are a little bit different. I'm really happy to say that because of this partnership that we have with ICMA and National League of Cities, we are providing discounts to members of those two organizations. And we're also trying to pay attention to the needs of smaller communities. And so what we're really recommending is that you connect, just go to our landing page, and we'll be more than happy to provide you more of a specific feel around what those costs are. Are there any other questions that anybody has? I will say that we are happy to send out a recording of this webinar to everyone who has registered. So hopefully you all haven't been taking too rapid of notes because you'll be able to get it in the recording that we'll send out probably within a week. And we'll also provide you with some supportive show notes that will kind of help you understand some of the comments that we shared with you today. Here's a question for PJ. What advice do you have for a community that does not regularly do surveys?
Yeah, no, I think what you can do there is look at your current practices. How are you outreaching to communities? Is it in person? Is it social media? Is it through a newsletter, through email, website? I mean, there's other ways you can engage with your community if you're not doing a survey. Again, surveys are one tool, but it's not the only tool out there. And especially for the hard to reach communities and residents, like Cory mentioned earlier, you need to sort of go back on a regular basis to engage, re-engage, and really utilize and leverage community leaders and community organizations that already have a network and relationships with members of your community to get the message across and to engage. And so those are some things that you can do if you don't have surveys in place.
PJ, I just want to really compliment you and congratulate Moorpark for the work that you're doing. It's really cool how you have embedded that resident sentiment into your planning process and your budgeting work. And you're right, it takes all forms of engagement to be successful. But it really, really seems like Moorpark is doing just excellent work around engaging and paying attention to that authentic connection with your residents to help guide decision-making. So thanks so much for being part of this panel today.
Welcome, happy to be here.
I also do want to note, just because I've been doing resident engagement for 30 years and doing all kinds, but the reason why we settle back on surveys for folks who haven't done them is they probably are the most cost-efficient way to get a representative sample of opinions in your community. There are all kinds of other modes you need to use, but if you ask me in any community, the best way to get feedback from a broad variety of residents, I'm going to say survey because it's the least burdensome, because it takes them 5 or 10 minutes instead of hours, and it's also more candid. Some people don't really want to stand up in front of a microphone or call a council member and say what's going on, particularly when you start talking about household challenges with COVID. People may not want to say in front of other people that they don't have enough food, they don't have the right kind of housing, they can't pay for cable. And so the survey is really by far the most efficient means to get resident input. Again, not the only way you should do it, but I just want to put out a plug for that's why I always recommend it in any kind of evaluation project or any type of community dialogue. If I can put a survey into it, I will. So just my 2 cents on resident engagement and the efficiency of that.
Thanks, Michelle. Well, that's great. Thanks all of you for attending this webinar. We're going to be having 2 additional webinars in July and 1 in August to kind of advocate and promote the engagement through this ARPA process and the tools that we can make available for communities. But we really appreciate your attendance today and look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks to ICMA for helping with this.